Hi, today we're going to talk about the views of José Ortega y Gasset, a Spanish philosopher of the early 20th century. He is a perspectivist. He calls his view contextualism and refers to vital reason. Ortega's views have been highly influential in a variety of parts of the world. He's deeply influenced by earlier continental philosophers, people like Martin Heidegger, for example, and he himself then exerts significant influence on the existentialists. I think Ortega's views are extremely interesting. They are a view that I think has a certain relationship to relativism. It's not the same view, though. It's a view that I've called perspectivism. And we'll look at that and see how he develops this idea. It is related to, but somewhat different in its development from the view in Jainism that is described as non-absolutism or non-one-sidedness. But it does have a lot of similarity to it. So let's begin with the contrast between realism and idealism. Ortega begins thinking about that, and he finds both views unsatisfying. After all, the idealist contends that everything is mind-dependent. The entire world is something like a mental construction, a mental projection. And he finds that itself a somewhat bizarre view. He says, wait, everything is just mental? Well, here's one of the things that makes that an unsatisfying view. There are hard realities, not of our own making. Surely, things like tornadoes, hurricanes, and so forth are not simply things we project onto the world, we construct. I mean, why would we construct them? Seems like a really bad idea. And so he says, look, there's something really unyielding about the world that this can't capture. There's a quotation from Camille Paglia that I'm fond of that expresses a very similar point. Hey, fellas, there's something out there that electrocutes people on beaches, collapses buildings like cardboard, and drowns ships and villages. It's called nature. And that's kind of Ortega's point. It's like, look, how does the idealist make any sense of nature? Of forces, very powerful forces outside of us. The unyielding nature of reality. If it's really all mental, if it's all a construction, then these things are in effect something like nightmares as part of this dream? What is this? I mean, there's something fundamental about reality that idealism, he thinks, simply cannot capture. But on the other hand, if we turn to realism, he says, I'm not that satisfied with it either. Because the realist does hold some things are independent of mind, so the idea that there are hard realities, a firm, unyielding character to the real world, yes, the realist has no problem explaining that. But then how do mind and world relate? Isn't this going to lead to skepticism, to this gap between mind and world that suggests that somehow I've got all these thoughts, ideas, feelings, perceptions, I formulate theories, but wait, they're going on at the level of mind. How do I ever get to the world? How do I have any reason to believe that I am understanding the world correctly? It looks like realism isolates the mind from the world and makes it impossible to understand how knowledge can even be. So, there's a classic argument for idealism, skepticism. And Ortega says that deserves to be taken seriously. The idealist, like Bishop Berkeley, steps in to say precisely, you put a gap between mind and world, well, you're not going to be able to get across that gap. And so in the end, the skeptic is going to win, going to say, I don't have any reason to think these actually meet or that this is serving as a mirror of that. Mind and world look divided and I can't get them together. And as we've seen, the idealist pushes it up into the mind and in effect says, don't worry, the world is mental. So if the world is just a creature of the mind, you can have knowledge of it, yay. But you can see why Ortega's unhappy. He says, wait, there's a real hard, fast world here. It's got all sorts of things in it we can't control and that are not just mental, they can kill us. So he says, I can't push the world up into mind. That seems to me the wrong solution. Well, the alternative, push mind down into world. Materialism does that in a kind of crude way. What Ortega does is do that in a much more sophisticated, dynamic way. So, he says, here's the way to think about it, really. In fact, the better way than thinking of mind being pushed down into the world is to think of the two becoming intertwined. Think, look, they meet together. Mind and world are part of the same whole. The world cannot be understood without appeal to our own cognitive faculties, of course. We've got to cognize it mentally. But we can't understand ourselves without appeal to the world. So we can't even turn and examine our own cognitive faculties without examining the world. Mind and world are part of the same organic unity. It's not like we have mind on one level and world on another. It's not that world somehow gets dissolved into mind, or that mind gets dissolved into world. It's really that the two are mixed up together and we study them both together. So his view he calls contextualism. I am myself and my circumstances, he says. Now, at first glance, that sounds odd. I am myself and something else, but I am myself and the circumstances that define me, that give me a range of possibilities that I can act from. He says every life is a point of view directed on the universe. Strictly speaking, what one life sees, no other can. Each of us occupies a certain standpoint, a certain point of view on the universe. And I am me, well, in a sense, together with that standpoint, together with that context, that perspective, that circumstance that gives me that perspective. There is no such thing as a view from nowhere. Philosophers have sometimes talked about the view from here, from this place where I sit, your position where you sit, and so forth. All of that is contrasted with this view from nowhere. Kant, for example, talks about the impartial rational spectator and says, wait a minute, the happiness of someone who lacked a good and pure will in every respect could never give pleasure to an impartial rational spectator, would never seem like a good thing viewed from nowhere. Where's nowhere? Ortega says there's no such thing as a view from nowhere. You've got to reject that ideal. Philosophy has had that kind of ideal in the West, at least since Plato, but probably going back much further. And the same thing is true of all sorts of other traditions. They've tried to describe the world as it is from your point of view, from my point of view. No, taking the view from nowhere. Here's how it is, absolutely speaking. And Ortega's point is, we always see things from a certain point of view, shaped by our own context, our own circumstances. I am myself and my circumstances. There is no view from nowhere. There's just the view from here, and from there, and from there, and from there, and so on. There is no such thing as the view from everywhere at once, nor is there the view from nowhere, like an impartial, rational spectator, like somebody on the mountaintop looking down at all the rest of us and looking down at the world. There's no such mountaintop. So he says, I and my circumstances together constitute life. Vital reason is the project of trying to understand the world and understand myself and understand my mind in particular, but doing all of that together, recognizing that I and my circumstances go together in this way. Reason can come to reliable conclusions only when it recognizes that intertwined character, only when it focuses on life, on myself and my circumstances, taking the mind and the world, subject and object, into account together. Those have to be understood together. If they aren't understood together, he says, it will be impossible to understand either one. So, vital reason, well, it is myself and my circumstances. Not just the things around me, but I've got to understand my circumstances in their historical context. I've got to realize they are dynamic, they develop over time. So this is not only a contextualism, but a dynamic contextualism. The context change, the history and circumstances change. So I change too. We can't understand ourselves or our circumstances without understanding how they've come about. When I do that, when I adopt this perspective that is contextualist, that's historical, that's dynamic, then I realize I am in part what I've been. I'm in part what I am at this very moment, shaped by what I've been and where I've been in my circumstances, but also what I am is shaped by the future that is possible for me. I am free to choose among the various possible futures for me, but that freedom is bounded and those futures are bounded. Inevitably, in understanding myself, I understand my own limitations. Sometimes, and in part, they're imposed by aspects of the world that aren't my own making. Some of my limitations come from me. Yeah, I'm a limited being and I have limited abilities and capacities and so on. But some of it comes from the world. It just puts me in a certain place where certain things are possible for me, other things aren't. So he says, look, we're free to choose who we are, but the freedom is bounded. I can choose who I am, but only given my circumstances and what I become and what options are open to me. Our lives are dramas in which our freedom confronts the boundaries, and we often fight against those boundaries. Sometimes we stay sheepishly within them. But the idea is that I am free to act, but within this drama, that my circumstances, my historical circumstances, the concepts that are given to me by my culture, my society, my history, all of that defines for me. So I was somebody born in the 1950s in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Here I am as a baby. That time and place helps to define me. Here's the house I lived in when I was young. That's something that put me in a particular historical context, a certain neighborhood in South Pittsburgh. I was in that specific city at that time and place. I was, well, you know, I learned about all sorts of things in the history before me, but on the other hand, I faced a very different set of options and I have a different set of perspectives. There are all sorts of things I can be, but all sorts of things, well, that I could never have been. I could not have decided, I want to be a Roman consul, for example. That could have been maybe 2,000 years before, can't be now, and couldn't be when I was a child. That wasn't realistic for me. I could become a philosophy professor. Yay, I did that. There are other things I could have done. My grandpa wanted me to become a plumber like him. Well, that was a possible future for me. I didn't do that. So there were different options I faced, but some of them were real options. Yes, I could have done that. I could have become a musician. I could have become a plumber. I could have followed some of my uncles into their various professions and become a bus driver or a steel worker. But no, instead, I took this path. But I couldn't have become a Roman consul. I couldn't have become a medieval monk. I hear they actually had allocated to them like a gallon of ale a day. Sounds pretty good, actually. However, no, can't do that. Too old for that. I can't, for the same sort of reason, become a starship captain. That is an option that might be available to future people, isn't available to me. So I'm tied and bounded by my culture, by my place in history. And that makes certain things possible for me, certain things impossible for me. Some things might be metaphysically impossible for me. I cannot, for example, become a cartoon character in South Park. I am a human being. I can't be a cartoon character. I can't go back in time and become T.S. Eliot, for example. Or I can't marry Ingrid Bergman. Too bad, but I'm too young. I was born too late, as the song goes. Can't do those things. And for similar metaphysical reasons, I can't become a roadrunner or a cat or something else. And so I'm bounded in part by my very nature, in part by my place in history, in part by my own social circumstances, my own cultural circumstances, maybe my own socioeconomic circumstances. Lots of things are possible for me, but it's bounded. Lots of other things are ruled out by all of these conditions, many of them beyond my control. Ortega's perspectivism, then, is a view that says, I have a way of understanding the world, but it's shaped by my circumstances. And I am free to shape that understanding of the world in various ways, but they are bounded by all sorts of considerations, not all of which are my own making. This is not Nietzsche's relativism, notice. It is instead something that actually implies the existence of truth. It doesn't reject it as incoherent. But here is the way he thinks of it. Ortega says, think of describing a landscape. Let's say a house surrounded by trees. No one perspective on that scene captures it completely. But no view is arbitrary. No view is merely a mental construction. No view is just something that we reject as, unknowable or false or, well, yeah, that's true at best for you. No, it really is a perspective on reality. It's not arbitrary, but neither is it the full picture. So, take a look at this house. Here's how it looks out from one avenue. Here's how it looks from the side. It's the same house. Now notice, it looks rather different. I wouldn't have guessed, just seeing those two photographs, that that was the same house. But it is the same house. The Stuart Gilbert House, by the way, in Philadelphia, right next to the place where the Declaration of Independence was signed. So Independence Hall is just off there to the right as you're looking at the house from this particular direction. Well, you look at that house and you see it from different points of view. No one photograph captures that house. But you move around it, you see it from different perspectives. You get a better understanding of what the house looks like. So, Ortega says reality happens to be like a landscape, possessed of an infinite number of perspectives, all equally veracious and authentic. The sole false perspective is that claims to be the only one there is. In other words, that which is false is utopia, a non-localized truth, which can't be seen from any particular place. Reject the view from nowhere. Reject the idea of utopia, whether it's an ethical or political utopia, or whether it's an epistemic utopia. We take the view from nowhere and we see the absolute truth. He says, no, there is no absolute political ideal. There is no absolute ethical ideal. There is no absolute scientific ideal that we can shoot for. Instead, he says, we're always seeing things from a point of view. We're always seeing things from a certain perspective. You can't see the house as it looks all directions at once. You can see it from different points of view. You can see different photographs of it. You can go inside and get a number of different perspectives from the inside. You can see it from above, like this, and get a perspective on how it looks from the air. So maybe you could identify the truth about the house and trees, that landscape, with the totality of all the possible perspectives on them. But that totality is not itself a perspective. There's no place to stand from which you can see the house from all points of view at once. Not outside the house, not under it, not above it, not within it. There is no one point of view that captures it exactly. There are different perspectives, and each one is a perspective on the house. But we don't want to say, yes, the house is this shape. Well, for you. Well, it is from that point of view. But the house may actually have a real shape. You're seeing only one side of it. You've got to see other sides to get some idea of what it's really like. Here's a little test. I'm going to show you a series of photographs. How many houses are depicted in these photographs? Well, the answer is just one. And there you can see the combination that actually shows you both sides at once. You see all of those with the brown shingles and you think, okay, I guess that could all be one house. Then you see the side with the white woodwork or the light gray woodwork. You think, well, I guess that's a house. They don't look like they go together at all until you see that photograph and realize, wait, it looks completely different from the sides and the back and then from that front straight head-on view. Different parts were added at different times. This is an old rambling house in New Hampshire, and it looks very different from different sides. Well, reality is a bit like that house, and you have to step back and try to see it from different points of view, or ideally walk around it, walk inside it, get a sense of how this house is actually put together, how it looks from different points of view. When you do that, sometimes you get perspectives that let you see something important about the nature of that house. Other times you see something that's pretty misleading if you think that tells me what the house as a whole is like. And reality is the same way. Every one of those views is a view of the house. It is a view of how this looks from there. And so it's accurate from that point of view. But nevertheless, it can be highly misleading if you think that's what the house is like, right? It is like that from that point of view, but it's actually overall rather different. And so it's easy to be misled. And reality is just like that. Ortega is saying, yes, we're always seeing reality from a certain point of view. I'm seeing it from this point of view, from that perspective, from this one. The more perspectives I can take into account and see it from, the better understanding I will have of that reality. Some of those perspectives on reality tell me some important things and let me understand important things about the nature of reality. Others are highly misleading. Yeah, it's true of that perspective. It's true from that point of view, but wow, is that a misleading point of view? The whole is nothing like that at all. And so it's important to see things from different points of view. None of them are absolutely false. They're views of reality, and they are perspectives on it. And they're getting something right, but they can be highly misleading about the whole character. So inevitably, we see things from a certain perspective. We see the world from human perspectives shaped by our circumstances, by our history, by our own abilities, by our own choices. We cannot see it from nowhere. We can't see it sub specie aeternitatis. That is to say, from the perspective of eternity, from God's point of view. That is impossible for us. Ortega says all knowledge is knowledge from a definite point of view. Spinoza's species aeternitatis, that is to say, or ubiquitous and absolute point of view, has no existence on its own account. It is a fictitious and abstract point of view. It can be useful because we can think about that view from nowhere, that God's eye point of view, as a way of thinking about what reality is really like independently of our points of view. Unlike the relativists, we don't immediately scramble and say, no such thing. The thing is, that's something like the infinite combination of all these perspectives. It isn't itself a perspective. It could be if we imagined ourselves somehow outside of the world looking at it. This is that dot you see there, the small dot. That's the Earth as viewed from Saturn. Well, that's an amazing thing, but there's no such thing as taking the position from Saturn and looking at the universe as if we're viewing it from nowhere. There is no way of stepping outside of the world and seeing the world as if we're above it, neutrally, from nowhere. No, we're within the world. We never get that sort of perspective on the world. We are down in the world, and inevitably we see things from a perspective within that world. It may or may not be the same perspective as Ortega's. Here's a painting of him that I'm very fond of, partly because it shows many, many different facets all at once. Of course, it's partly the style of painting, partly a matter of doing a lot with that palette knife, but partly it's something that reflects the multifaceted nature of the world and of perspectives as Ortega sees it. No other portrait of Ortega really would seem to do his view justice. So the underlying perspective is this. We've got a view here that is contextualist, that's historical, that's dynamic, and that's perspectivist, in that it says, really, I am myself and my circumstances. I am seeing the world from a certain point of view. I can describe it accurately from my point of view, but it's a limited view, and it might be a misleading view. The more people's perspectives I can take into account, the better I'm going to understand the world, just as I'll get a richer and richer understanding of a landscape by moving around in it and seeing it from different points of view.